Well, joining me now is the Conservative MP Bob Seely and Lord Sassoon, President of the China-Britain Business Council and a Treasury Ministry for George Osborne. Good evening to both of you. When Rishi Sunak says that we have to evolve our policy towards China, Lord Sassoon, what do you think he means by evolving it?
Well, what I interpret by his robust pragmatism, as I think we're now into, is a resumption of trade and economic talks with China. We have 130,000 and more jobs dependent on exports to China, and we haven't been talking at a high level to the Chinese for the last 3 years, leaving our competitors, the Americans, the EU, even now Australia is resuming trade talks. So what I very much welcome in the Prime Minister's speech is what I see as a signal to resuming the talks, which means we'll be fighting for British jobs out with the Chinese government. Fighting for British jobs, is that how you interpret it, Bob Seely?
I think I interpret the robust pragmatism in a slightly different way. Yes, we need to be engaging. We have, Lord Sassoon is absolutely right, and there are jobs at stake here. But we are becoming economically increasingly dependent on China, just as China is trying to become economically self-sufficient. And it is doing this to increase its power in the Pacific, in Taiwan, and we have to recognise a systemic threat. And I'm afraid to say people who don't do that, I think, are dangerously complacent.
It's interesting because Liz Truss called it a threat, but Rishi Sunak doesn't call it a threat. Lord Sassoon.
Well, I think we have to be extremely careful. I mean, it's interesting, actually, Bob, because the Henry Jackson Society, which you've written for, did a report, not much seen because it was in June 2020, which actually said, looking at strategic sectors, the UK was least dependent of the Five Eyes security partners
I wrote the report.
on China. You wrote it. I should give you the credit. So I think we have to be very careful, but I think selling more Range Rovers, selling more AstraZeneca pharmaceuticals...
But actually what China wants to do is actually have a toehold. You know, Huawei... Hinkley Point, we had to pull out of Huawei because the Americans changed the rules. But was it right to pull out of Huawei?
The French, the Germans, the EU as a whole haven't.
Yes.
Yet.
So I don't do the security assessments. They're done in Banbury.
Let's talk about that.
Can I just correct you there? All Five Eyes nations, that was the basis of the report, are increasingly dependent on critical national infrastructure and other goods and have an increased critical dependency on China. And we need to recognise that, because the idea that China sees trade in an unmercantilist way is simply naive. China is using trade for power and potentially to fit in with a wider strategic power against Taiwan. We have to see that.
So most recently, of course, has been an example of that, because the government ordered the Chinese to divest from the chip maker in Newport on security grounds.
I'm very glad that it has done so.
On security grounds. Is the watchword here that you can do trade with China, but you can't do anything that threatens security?
I think we can't be naive about this. We are taking a non-mercantilist approach to trade. And what I mean by that is China is deliberately trying to increase dependency whilst at the same time becoming more self-sufficient, because we're seeing one of the great historical trends now, that power is flowing back to the east.
Well, let me just ask you that very question. Was the UK government right to force China to divest from that microchip maker in Newport?
Well,
yes.
Kirsty, look, I agree with you with the premise of your question with Bob on this, that perhaps in the past, independent of whether it's China or anywhere else, we needed a tighter law. We've now got it in the NSIA, the National Security Investment Act. I think the point now is that we need to be as transparent and consistent in the way that is enforced.
So should we have them involved in microchip processing in Newport or not?
Well, that's an assessment, on that case by the...
But it's also a political assessment.
I'm not the people who did the assessment. I mean, my point, I think, for the health of British manufacturing and inward investment is that we need a policy that was probably tougher than we had it before. We need to implement it consistently if we want to get continuing investment into this country.
If we want to get continuing investment for China, is it the case, though? We talked about naivety, or Rishi Sunak talked about naivety, but in the end, what you're saying is the fact that there are 12 million Uyghurs in China, 1 million of whom are in camps, the others who don't have the same rights. Do we just say, Really? Nothing to do with us?
No, we don't. We have some of the toughest laws that impact on our companies and their supply chains. And if we start resuming the trade talks which will help our businesses get more permissions to sell goods into China, then it gives us the opportunity to talk about the Uyghurs, to talk about Hong Kong, to talk about the other issues.
Have we learned from Russia?
No, we haven't.
No dependency, least dependency on China is best.
Well, we're making the same mistake with China as we made with Russia. Europe became energy dependent on Russia, and look what happened. We're now becoming economically dependent on China, and when China invades Taiwan, it will say, you're not going to put sanctions down because it'll collapse your global economies. There's a global trend here. Authoritarian states are in crisis, Iran, Russia, China, but at the same time, they're using artificial intelligence and big data to try to control.
Lord Sassoon?
I think our companies are very well aware of the danger, but if we are selling what we're selling into their market, consumer goods, pharmaceuticals, helping them develop a savings market that's safe for the Chinese...
That's not going to change the Communist Party. But the Communist Party runs a one-party state, and just say flogging them some more Range Rovers is going to change the nature of Chinese communism. Sorry,
It seems to suggest that you each think there's something for you in Rishi Sunak's speech.
Yeah, look, we're not going to stop trading with these people. We have to realise that, but at the same time, we have to defend our values, and we have to understand the big geopolitical game that China is playing, and just get to grips with it a bit better.
Thank you both.